welcome back to the show. This is our book talk segment, and we're going to talk comedy tonight, particularly comedy writing from one of the best in the business. And if you recognize that music, you may have recognized from the early Saturday Night Live years, and our guest has written for Saturday Night Live in the heyday when it began. He's written for all the great names, including Billy Crystal. He's written for Gary Shandling, and of course he's been on with Curb Your Enthusiasm, written for that show, and of course Saturday Night Live. And the new book out is called Laugh Lines, My Life Helping Funny People Be Funnier. We're joined tonight by Alan Zweibel on the telephone for a couple of minutes. And Alan, great to talk with you. Also good to talk to a fellow Long Islander. You're talking to another one here.
Where are you from, Doug?
Floral Park.
Okay, so my old accountant who died lived in Floral Park.
Oh, really?
But he's dead, so I
don't... Maybe we knew him. I don't know.
All right, well, I'll give you his name afterwards.
That's right.
His family, but I don't want to upset them.
Well, I knew you were a Long Island guy, and I've seen you on different shows and heard you on different shows. You're from Woodmere, right?
Yeah, we started in Wantaw, and then my father had a couple of very good seasons in the jewelry business.
Right.
So we moved to the 5 towns. Yeah, so we moved to Woodmere, and I graduated Hewlett High School.
Yeah, I went to high school in Garden City, and one of our rivalry schools was in Woodmere, so I know the area well. But always good to talk to a Long Island guy. It's a little different than New York City. Long Island people are different, good in a good way.
I liked it. I had fun growing up there, and I like going back there. And the Long Island Book Festival is fun to do. And whenever I have a book that comes out, I'm usually booked in a couple of venues out there, and I find the people very warm and a lot of fun.
Haven't been up there in a while. I got to get back, but now you're in Jersey now, right? You're based mostly?
I'm in New Jersey.
Right.
After dividing our time for many years between Los Angeles and Jersey, we ended up coming back to New Jersey full time because that's where our children and grandchildren are. And but I'm on a lot of planes when you were allowed to fly on a plane,
right,
back and forth to L.A., depending upon the movie or whatever it is I'm doing out there.
Yeah, how's it going? Obviously, you have a book in mind to be published at a certain date, and nobody can predict what's happened. Has that affected it a lot? I know you can do like you're doing radio on the phone tonight, but has it affected the book tour much?
Well, I'll tell you how it affected the book tour. There is no tour. I mean, the 92nd Street Y here in New York City, for example, a couple of weeks ago to launch the book, the night of the launch, I was scheduled to be in conversation with Lewis Black, and that was sold out. But then it had to be postponed,
right,
until God knows when. And then a week later, doing the same thing in Los Angeles with my friend Larry David, that was postponed. However, you make up for it in different ways, not only on things like this, but, a lot of Zoom interviews, and the media has picked up on this book a lot. The reviews have been terrific. And what it is like in the middle of all of this, people want a diversion. They want a couple of laughs, and they're finding this book to be that. So I'm very grateful for that. I'm sorry it was at this price, though. I'd rather be on tour and, in front of a lot of people and on the late night talk shows. But, you adjust.
I had a chance to read through the book. Jeff sent it to me, and I really enjoyed it. I was always been kind of a student of comedy. My uncle, I don't know if you knew him. He was obviously before probably your time as well. His name was Tom Dillon. He was the shepherd of the Lambs Club. I know you're a friar, and he was in the Lambs, and he worked with a guy named Bert Wheeler. So we always had kind of comedy in our family. We kind of kept, what was going on there. He was on Ed Sullivan a bunch of times, all the shows. But I've always enjoyed kind of the history of comedy, and your book really goes into that, not only your history, but some of the great comedians you've worked with.
Well, I've been really lucky, and one of the reasons I wrote this book, I go around the country and I have speaking engagements, and I tell my story, and I realized somewhere along the way that I may be the only one or the last one whose career spans the Catskill Mountains through SNL, through its Gary Shandling show, through Letterman, for whom I also wrote,
right,
Broadway, and most recently a movie that I did with my friend Billy Crystal that will star Billy and Tiffany Haddish. We're editing it now. And so I realized that there's a big span there, and I've been fortunate enough to be on the forefront of a lot of changes in comedy. So at the behest of a few people who saw me speak, I finally said, okay, let me write this down. So that's what this book is.
You mentioned the Borscht Belt. Again, as we mentioned, I grew up in Long Island. I never got to go there specifically, but you always, saw the ads, who the great comedians were up there. I guess in the heyday of the 50s and 60s, all the big names started out up there, a lot of them anyway. That must have been a lot of fun for you. You were a young guy starting out your career writing jokes up there for a comedian I remember from mostly game shows, Morty Gunty.
Well, in the 50s and the 60s, the Catskills was the breeding ground for a comedy, and that's where people like Buddy Hackett and Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis and Toady Fields and Alan King, that's where they worked before they got their big break
right.
to have their own shows, their own variety series, their own situation comedy, certainly their own Las Vegas act. So by the time I got there in the early 70s, right out of college, it was very, very sentimental to me to go back there because I remembered going there as a kid. Our parents would take us there on a Labor Day weekend, Memorial Day weekend, and I would sneak into the, into the nightclubs and watch these comedians that I wasn't allowed to see because I was 12 and 13 years old. And now I'm up there writing for a bunch of them. So yeah, it was a real kick at first.
Just from talking to some of the comedians over the years and reading about it, of course, you talk about it in your book as well. Those were the toughest audiences, obviously, and you had to forge your act up there, or else you pretty much were booed off the stage, or people walked out. Wasn't that the deal up there? People walked out on you.
Well, not when I was there, but you know what they had a lot of times? They didn't laugh. They gave you what looked like wooden lollipops.
Yeah.
There were knockers, they were called. And if you thought something was funny, you knocked it on the table. And there were a lot of times you didn't hear any knocks. It was tough.
I wish I was able to go up there. Just reading about it, it sounded like it was a lot of fun. And for many years, it was the vacation spot for people from New York, Long Island. Unfortunately, I guess there's nothing left there, right? Maybe one or two hotels left. It's pretty much gone, right?
Well, they're all gone, and the ones that are left, the culture is different. It isn't any, they hung out and they worked for many years in the red with the hopes that gambling would come
right.
up there and resuscitate the region the way it did with Atlantic City. Well, that never happened.
Yeah. So
slowly but surely, hundreds of hotels started closing, and bungalow colonies and all these places where comedians got their start, but at its peak, the Concord Hotel, which was it's not the biggest one, it had until the MGM Grand was built in Las Vegas in the early 80s. Until then, the Concord Hotel had the biggest nightclub in the country. It was like 3,100 people it sat.
Right.
It seated, so it was, in its heyday, that was the spot. That was the place to get your start, and that was the place to come back to when you were a star, so you could be a headliner.
Laugh Lines is the name of the book. My Life Helping Funny People Be Funnier, and Alan Zweibel is our guest. And we mentioned you got started writing jokes. I guess you start kind of having those funny thoughts, or writing them down as a kid. What was I know you talk about it in the book, but what was kind of the first time you realized, hey, I can write something down that other people are going to laugh at?
When I was in high school and I hadn't studied for a test, I would write a poem that explained why I wasn't prepared to take the test that day, and it would make the teacher laugh. She would still fail me, but at least she laughed, okay? And then it just sort of snowballed when I went to college. I went to the University of Buffalo, and I would watch the Dick Cavett show. I watched Johnny Carson had a show here in New York.
Sure.
He had the Tonight Show here. And there was a show called That Was the Week That Was in the 60s. And I would send material to them that I wrote in my dorm room. Same thing with Mad Magazine. And I didn't sell anything, but the stuff they were doing, either in their monologues on television or publishing in Mad Magazine, I saw that my stuff was close enough. It was what professional writers were doing, and I took that as encouragement. Do you know what I mean? That maybe I did have something to offer.
There's always everybody thinks, oh, I can tell a joke or write a joke, but there's a special talent. You obviously have it to take something going on in the news or something you see and kind of condensing it into one or two lines and having that punchline. It's a special talent. I obviously you have that. Did you just kind of develop it on your own? Did you realize you had it?
Because once again, the Catskill guys, they were all about setups and punchlines. They weren't storytellers.
Right.
They weren't people like George Carlin or David Steinberg, people who came later. My friend Billy Crystal, my friend Larry David. Yeah, they were hilarious. But they told their jokes within a context of a story.
Right.
And that's what, Robert Klein, so that was my generation. Before I got to Catch a Rising Star and the improvisation, which is where those guys were starting, those were two showcase clubs in New York in the 70s. When I was up in the Catskills, it was more of a staccato kind of rhythm. Da-da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da, punchline. Do you know what I'm saying?
Right.
And then I got tired of writing to those guys. They were twice my age. They didn't have the same life experience I did, whether it be Woodstock or wanting to talk about Watergate, Nixon resigning. So I took all the jokes those old guys wouldn't buy from me, and I made a stand-up comedy act for myself and went on stage in these places, down, like Catch a Rising Star, to advertise the material. I didn't want to be a comedian. I just told the jokes with the hopes that a manager or an agent would come along, like the material, and want to represent me. And one night, Lorne Michaels saw me,
right,
and he was putting together a show called Saturday Night Live that was going to premiere in the fall. And he was looking for actors and writers in all the New York clubs. And I had a meeting with him that was set up by my agent, a man named Leon Memoli, set it up for me. And I went there and I gave Lorne a binder with about 1,100 jokes in it. And in front of me, he read the first joke, and then he closed the binder, and we just chatted, and I left the binder with him. He had, obviously he went through all of it, and he had to give it to the NBC executives. But, if you ask Lorne, he'll tell you the basis of that one joke. He was so smart, he would read one joke and determine whether or not he liked the sensibility of the writer, the ingenuity that it took to write that joke. And that's how it happened with me, so that was the end of my stand-up comedy career, and I became a writer, one of the original writers on SNL when it started in 75.
What was the joke, the stamp joke? If you want to tell it, if not, it's okay.
Was it that one? Joke saying that the post office was about to issue a stamp commemorating prostitution in the United States. The 10-cent stamp, if you want to lick it, it's a quarter.
I love that joke.
and what's interesting is when I go around the country, like I said, I do speaking engagements. If I go to a college and I tell my story and I tell them that joke to 18 and 19-year-olds, a lot of them go, well, why would you want to lick a stamp?
Right.
Well, that's adhesive on the back. So, that joke is slowly, headed for the door.
Tell them to read a book. Realize what it was used to be like. That's a funny joke.
Yeah,
They can't be outdated. It's funny. And then, of course, you started with Saturday Night Live and worked in really the beginnings of it. Now, I have to say, I was in 8th grade when it came on. I didn't get really into the show for a couple of years after, until it's, I guess maybe 3rd or 4th year. That's when high school kids, I guess, started to watch it. But, boy, a lot of books have been written on just that show alone. But being part of that writing staff and the great cast, you talk, of course, about Gilda Radner and all the people you worked with, quite a time.
Well, I worked with them all, with Gilda and Belushi and Aykroyd, Lorraine Newman, and then people like Steve Martin would host, and Buck Henry, who was my idol growing up. And so the people who came through its doors, and then Chevy leaves and Bill Murray replaces him, and you look at the 45-year history of that show, the people who came through it, Will Ferrell and Tina Fey and Amy Poehler and Lovett and Adam Sandler and Dennis Miller. It goes on and on and on, and it's in its 45th season now. I think personally that Kate McKinnon is a gift from God, and Cecily Strong, it's just the talent that has been on that show both acting and writing is just phenomenal.
It's almost amazing, and again, you talk about it in the book as well, but other people, read about that have been on the show. The limited time, obviously, you have to put it together. When you're doing a live show, you have 5 days, and really a lot of it isn't written until almost maybe Wednesday, sometimes not even until Saturday afternoon, right? So it's amazing how much great work has been done in that short amount of time during a week.
Well, the bulk of the show is written on Tuesday.
Right.
There's a read-through on Wednesday, and it's determined what sketches would be in. And you have to do it that way because that's, now sets have to be built and wardrobe has to be designed. So there's a process that goes, that begins. As far as the writing is concerned, you tweak your sketches up until airtime and weekend update. I remember that there were times that after the dress rehearsal in front of an audience on Saturday night, once that audience left, I would go up to my office, watch TV, and if something on the 11 o'clock news struck me as funny, I would write a joke and it would be on television a half hour later on Weekend Update. Now I write books, I write plays, I write movies, and if I'm lucky, it doesn't see, it sees the light of day 2 years from now. That's if I'm lucky. The movie I just finished shooting with Billy Crystal, that with he and Tiffany Haddish, it was based on a short story that I had written. And once Billy and I started writing it, it was 3 years until the script was really in shape and we started casting and getting the financing and whatever. Whereas with SNL or any television show, but certainly a live TV show, there was one show that we did on SNL. It was a live show down from the Mardi Gras.
Oh, sure.
In Louisiana. And I was on the reviewing stand and I was under the desk writing jokes and handing it up to them while they were on the air. So that's pretty immediate,
Yeah, I was just going to ask you about that. You were literally handing jokes while it was on the air. So that was the Mardi Gras show. I didn't realize that was the one. I knew you had done that. But,
yeah, it was the Mardi Gras show. And we had all these jokes about a parade that was supposed to pass in front of the reviewing stand.
Right.
So we had a list of all the floats and all the exhibits and everything. And there was a mishap at the beginning of the parade. I never got it straight whether somebody died or got run over or something. But the parade never came. And we had all these jokes about, about floats that never
saw them. Yeah, right.
So we had to, Herb Sargent and Buck Henry and I, Jane Curtin was the other anchor person with Buck, but me, Herb Sargent, and Buck were writing jokes about there not being a parade. And what you would have seen had this float went by on time.
Alan Zweibel is our guest. Laugh Lines is the name of the book. And I always wondered, obviously you were on one of the iconic shows, but do you ever kind of wish maybe for, a half a season or something, you could have been back in the 50s writing for Sid Caesar or Uncle Milty or those shows to see what that was like to be in the writer's room?
Well, I'm not so sure about Uncle Milty. That was a little broad to me, but my idols, and I was lucky enough to become friends with Mel Brooks and Carl Reiner and Larry Gelbart, the guys who are the core writing staff of Your Show is Shows.
Right.
My God, if I were older, I wish the only times I wish I was older is if I romanticize a little bit. I would have liked to have been alive in New York when the cabaret life was really, at its peak, or a few years before I came around, Greenwich Village,
Oh, sure.
Bitter End. Yeah, the Bitter End is still there, and it was always a place where people started. But I'm talking about when it was really vibrant, when Richard Pryor was starting there, and people like that, when, it was a few years before I came around, that would have been fun. And the TV shows that existed at the infancy of television, like Your Show is Shows. I'm reading Woody Allen's memoir right now called Apropos of Nothing, and it tells about those days, and because he was on a lot of those writing staffs, and I learned about it from Herb Sargent and Buck Henry. It sounds like it was a different world back then, and yeah, I would have loved to have experienced it.
Yeah, I would have loved that too. My parents, obviously, they were older parents when they had us, my sister and me, but they enjoyed going to the shows back then in the 50s, and places like the Copacabana and 21 and all the Stork Club, I guess, all those places that had the great entertainers. And of course, you mentioned the early 60s with the coffee houses. I guess that's where a lot of the like Woody Allen and Joan Rivers, they all started. Yeah,
they all started down there, and if you remember the song that the Mamas and Papas sang, Creek Alley.
Oh, sure.
In a coffee house, Sebastian sat. That was John Sebastian, and they're talking about McGuinn and McGuire. Roger McGuinn from the Byrds. You listen to that song, and who was there?
Right.
That was part of the scene. That was the musical part of the scene. So you had the comedic counterpart parts to it. So you had, the Lenny Bruces of the world and people who were doing different things at the time, which was antithetical to the Borscht Belt, which came a little bit before it.
Yeah. We're not going to go through every chapter in the book just so Alan doesn't get worried, but I did want to bring up, and we want the audience to read the book. Again, credit. It's a great show business book if you enjoy the history of comedy and kind of how it's put together. Laugh Lines is the book for you. But we mentioned Uncle Milty before, and my uncle was on that show a few times. He was also a singer, and he always said Uncle Milty would have a whistle during rehearsal. He was tough to work with. But and you had an experience, obviously, on Saturday Night Live. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, he was, on paper, it looked like a good idea. There was something poetic about the guy who at NBC, when he was in his heyday, had the #1 show, and it was at the infancy of television. And here, a generation later, there we were, and we were really popular and doing what we were doing. So, to bridge the two generations, if you will, sort of sounded like a good idea. But he was really steeped in his ways, which was to get the joke, to get the laugh. So in the middle of, it's the only, to my knowledge, it's the only show that Lorne Michaels has not repeated.
Right.
It was a disaster. I mean, he would be in the middle of a sketch, and let's say he was supposed to play the father, he would break the reality and look at the audience and crack a joke. And so the whole reality of the sketch would go away. All right. And I remember him, camera blocking his opening monologue, and at one point, this was just rehearsal in front of a camera, he told the director, he said, when I get to this point, I would like there to be a sound effect of a crowbar falling from above, landing on the studio floor, and sort of reverberating until it comes to a stop. And the director said, why? And Milton said, well, at that point, I will ad-lib. Well, it looks like NBC dropped another one. Now, here you had the greatest improv plays in the world. You had Gildy, you had Belushi, you had Stan, you had Bill Murray, okay, you had Lorraine, and he is planting an ad-lib, okay? So it was, you just take that and you just blow that up, and every which way you look at it, it was emblematic of what happened, on the whole show, Doug.
I've never, like you said, you can't get it. It's not even on YouTube. But there's a couple of clips I've found over the year. I'd love to see it just to see what it was like. But it's as bad as people think, huh?
Well, you want to know something? I haven't seen it since back then. And since I was in the studio, I don't remember a lot of it. What we tend to remember is the process.
Right.
We don't remember the product. I mean, I've done things that that didn't work, but my memory of it is really good because, that's when we met so-and-so, we became friends with such and such, so it's the experience of working with people and creating something. Once the product is made, it's in the hands of a different God,
right.
Whether or not they're going to like it, dislike it, timing, and all of that. And I've also worked on some things that were very successful, but my memory of it is like, so it's the process that you remember.
Sure. And there's a story in the book. You don't tell it now because you want the people to read it in the book about Uncle Milty in his dressing room. Well, let's leave it at that.
Leave it at that. And,
I know you've told it before, but let's let the audience read it. It's a classic.
I'll let them discover why ruin it. Yeah.
Many jokes were made about Uncle Milty at the Friars Club, but the people can make their own conclusions what this is about.
Yeah.
Well, the book is filled with stories like that, and again, Alan has written for so many. We mentioned Billy Crystal. You got the movie coming out. Is that coming out? Well, I guess everything's kind of up in the air now, but is that a fall movie with Billy?
Well, something, it was supposed to be in the Cannes Film Festival, and that got canceled, right?
Right.
I don't know if Toronto is going to happen. I don't know the status of it, if it's still on or if it's been canceled. So I think it will be in suspension until we see, what's the story with movie theaters, because this is the kind of movie that will make you laugh a lot and will also make you cry. So it's the kind of experience you have that you want to be surrounded by people who are going through the same emotional kind of journey that you are, as opposed to watching it alone with one or two other people on Netflix. Right. I have no idea what they have in mind for it.
Yeah.
It's going to be up to the producer, but at the same time, the hope would be that it will be seen by groups, large audiences. Where we're lucky is that we got done with it before this hit.
Right.
I know so many productions were closed down because of this. We finished shooting in November, and Billy's been doing the post-production, and we're a couple of weeks away from having a completely finished movie. There's some music that has to be done, and a little this, a little that, but it's been shot and the picture's been locked, and so we'll see. Very proud of it, though.
Of course, you and Billy, another fellow Long Islander, you grew up pretty much together, going into the city to the comedy club. You got a great story in the book about that.
That's how we started the two of us. When I was living back with my parents in Woodmere after college, and I started going to the club. Billy lived 4 or 5 towns over in Long Beach. He was already married and had their first child. And he would pick me every night in his little blue Volkswagen. We'd go into the city. We would tell our jokes. And on the way back, listen to the cassette and critique each other. And the fact that we not only are good friends, he's still Uncle Billy to the kids, the fact that he and I collaborated on a Broadway play that he did called 700 Sundays, which won a Tony Award and was one of the most rewarding experiences that I've had, not only in my career, but in my life.
Yep.
That my good friend trusted me with his family, and it was a big hit. But the process, once again, was wonderful, collaborating with him on something that was so important to him. And that most recently, this movie Here Today, that I just mentioned with him and Tiffany Haddish, which was also a joy to do. So I've been really lucky to be able to work with my friends like Larry David and Rob Reiner and still remain friends.
You're right. Well, love to have you on in the future because we haven't even gotten to Gary Shandling and, of course, Gilda and all the other stories. We'll do that another time. We've kept you longer than we said. But get the book out there. If you like the history of kind of comedy and how it's put together, Laugh Lines, My Life Helping Funny People Be Funnier by Alan Zweibel. He's been there, and he knows what he's talking about. And, Alan, a real pleasure talking to you. It's available everywhere, I guess. And your website, you want to give that out or any place they can get the book?
Yeah, you can go to Amazon. You can go Barnes & Noble. Those sites. My website is alanzweibel.com, so there's a link that takes you right to Amazon. The book is eminently gettable, selling well, and it seems that people, during these trying times, when they need a diversion or a couple of laughs, I'm very happy that they're looking to this book.
Great. It definitely delivers on that. And Alan, pleasure talking to you. I know you've been doing a lot of these, but I tried to ask you something a little different, I hope, but real good to talk to you.
I love talking to you, Doug. Your questions were really smart, and it was more of a conversation than a Q&A, and I appreciate everything, and I'd love to come on again whenever you want me.
Great. Thanks, Alan. We'll talk to you soon.
Take care, Doug. Thank you.
Alan Zweibel, our guest, and thank you for tuning in. We'll see you again real soon.